I had always taken pride in my yard. It wasn't some overgrown jungle or a dumping ground, it was my personal sanctuary. A place where my family and I had spent years planting flowers, tending to the grass, and even setting up a small decorative pond. But according to the HOA, it was an eyesore. The notice arrived on a Monday morning, tucked neatly into my mailbox alongside my regular mail. The bold letters at the top read, HOA violation, yard maintenance required immediately. I frowned as I skimmed through the letter. According to them, my yard was messy, unkempt, and in violation of community standards. It demanded that I clean it up within 7 days or face steep fines. I stood in my front yard, looking around. Messy? My yard was not messy. Sure, I had a few extra flower pots, a couple of garden gnomes, and a wooden trellis covered in vines, but that was intentional. My garden wasn't just some random patch of land, it was a tribute to my late wife. She had loved gardening. Every flower, every plant, every little detail had meant something to her. And now, it was all that remained of the life we built together. How dare the HOA call it an eyesore? The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. Who decided what was messy? What was too much? My next-door neighbor had a dull, lifeless lawn with nothing but rocks and a single tree. That was okay. But my yard, full of life and beauty, was somehow a violation. I knew I had to fight back, but first, I needed to understand why they were targeting me. So, I took a walk around the neighborhood. That's when I noticed something strange. A few houses down, I saw a yard far worse than mine, overgrown weeds, broken decorations, and even a rusted-out car sitting in the driveway. But guess what? No violation notice. Another neighbor had a pile of lumber stacked against his fence, old tools scattered on the lawn, and even an old mattress sitting by his garage. But again, no violation notice. Why me? Why my yard? I decided to confront the HOA directly. I attended the next board meeting, waiting patiently as they went through their usual motions. Finally, when they opened the floor for homeowner concerns, I stood up and held up my violation notice. Can someone explain to me why my well-maintained, flower-filled yard is a problem? I asked. While other homes in the neighborhood look like abandoned properties and get no citations. The HOA president, a smug-looking man named Mr. Carter, gave me a fake sympathetic smile. We enforce the rules equally, he said. Your yard simply doesn't match the aesthetic standards we've set for the community. I laughed, shaking my head. Oh, really? Then how do you explain the other houses that clearly violate these standards but get a free pass? Mr. Carter's smile faltered, and the other board members shuffled uncomfortably. It was clear they didn't expect to be called out. That's when I knew this wasn't about rules. It wasn't about aesthetics or keeping the neighborhood looking nice. It was personal. I could see it in their faces. Someone on that board had a problem with me, and they were using the HOA as a weapon. But what they didn't realize was I wasn't going down without a fight. I had 7 days to comply. 7 days to figure out my next move. 7 days before everything I loved was put at risk. I wasn't about to sit back and let them destroy my wife's legacy. I was going to fight back, and they had no idea what was coming. I wasn't about to let the HOA push me around without a fight. Their claim that my yard was too messy made no sense, especially when worse yards were left untouched. Something about this situation felt off, and I was determined to find out what was really going on. The first thing I did was gather proof. I spent the next day walking through the neighborhood, snapping pictures of yards that looked far worse than mine. Overgrown weeds, broken fences, rusted lawn ornaments. There were plenty of violations if you looked closely. But what stood out the most? None of these homes had received citations. I started noticing a pattern. The homes that received violation notices all belonged to people who had spoken out against the HOA in the past. One homeowner, Mr. Daniels, had openly criticized the HOA for their excessive fees. A single mother down the street had refused to pay a ridiculous fine for leaving a kid's bicycle outside overnight. And then there was me, someone who never attended meetings, never caused problems, but also never bent over for their nonsense rules. It became clear, the HOA wasn't enforcing rules fairly. They were punishing homeowners they didn't like while protecting the ones they did. I wasn't done yet. I needed more proof. So I turned to someone who knew the inner workings of the HOA better than anyone, my neighbor, Lisa. Lisa had been a member of the HOA board for years but had stepped down after clashing with Mr. Carter, the HOA president. When I told her about my violation, she wasn't surprised. "This isn't about your yard," she said, shaking her head. "They're trying to force you into compliance or get you to sell. They've done it before." I blinked. "Force me to sell?" Lisa sighed. "The HOA has been working with a real estate developer. They want to improve the neighborhood, which means getting rid of people who don't fit their vision. They push homeowners with bogus violations, excessive fines, and legal threats until they're forced to sell. Then they turn around and sell the property to their developer buddies for a hefty profit." My stomach twisted. This wasn't just about my yard. This was about control, power, and greed. Lisa leaned in. "You're not the first. But you can be the last, if you expose them." Now that I knew the truth, I needed evidence that could hold up against them. I started digging into the HOA's financial records. Lisa still had access to some old documents, and what we found was shocking. Over the past 2 years, the HOA had issued more fines than ever before, and most of them were against the same handful of homeowners. But here's the kicker: many of those homes were later sold to a development company linked to Mr. Carter. It was blatant corruption. The HOA was scamming people out of their homes. The next day, I went to the county records office to dig up property sales. My suspicions were confirmed. The same 3 real estate developers had purchased multiple properties from HOA victims, always after massive fines or legal threats. And one of those developers? Carter Holdings. Mr. Carter wasn't just the HOA president, he was profiting directly from the homeowners they were targeting. This was more than just harassment. It was a full-blown racket. I had enough proof to take them down, but I needed to play it smart. If I made my move too early, they might cover their tracks. If I waited too long, they'd come after me harder. So, I decided to let them think they were winning. I pretended to panic about my violation. I asked for an appeal, which, of course, they denied. I let them believe I was scrambling to comply, even going as far as to remove a few flower pots and trim the hedges. Meanwhile, I quietly started gathering allies, other homeowners who had been targeted. Mr. Daniels, the single mother, a few others who had been hit with outrageous fines. When I told them what I had found, they were furious. Some of them had already lost thousands to the HOA's schemes. Others had been on the verge of selling, thinking they had no choice. But now, we had a choice. We had proof. We had numbers. And soon, the entire neighborhood would know exactly what the HOA was hiding. The showdown was coming. And this time, they wouldn't get away with it. I had everything I needed: proof of corruption, a group of angry homeowners, and a burning desire to take the HOA down. But if I was going to win this battle, I needed to be smart. Going after an HOA is like fighting a snake. You don't just attack its tail, you go for the head. And in this case, the head was Mr. Carter. The first step was getting more people involved. I called for a community meeting, keeping it quiet so the HOA wouldn't catch wind of it. We gathered at Mr. Daniels' house, a group of nearly 20 homeowners, all of whom had been unfairly fined or harassed. I laid out everything: the pattern of targeted fines, the connections to the real estate developers, and the fact that Carter himself was profiting off our suffering. The room fell silent. Then, the outrage erupted. "They tried to do the same thing to me last year," one neighbor said. "They fined me for a non-compliant mailbox, but they let the HOA treasurer keep his rusted one," another shouted. The more we talked, the more the picture became clear. The HOA was picking off homeowners one by one, trying to drive out anyone who didn't fit their plan. "We need to take this public," I said. If we go to the press, if we show the city what's happening, they won't be able to hide it anymore. It wasn't just about getting back at them. It was about making sure they never did this to anyone else again. With the help of Lisa, I compiled everything: documents showing shady property sales, the pattern of targeted fines, even old emails Lisa had from her time on the board where Carter hinted at pushing out the troublemakers. But the best evidence? The HOA's own financial records. Lisa had kept copies of old meeting minutes, where they had discussed selling foreclosed homes to developers at a discounted rate. It was all there in black and white. I contacted a local news station and sent them everything. It didn't take long for them to realize the goldmine of corruption they had stumbled upon. They agreed to run the story, but they wanted an on-camera interview. I didn't hesitate. I wanted the whole world to see this. Somehow, word got out that we were planning something. Maybe someone tipped them off, or maybe Carter was just paranoid, but the very next day, I received a threatening letter from the HOA. It was a cease and desist notice, claiming that I was spreading false information and damaging the reputation of the HOA. They demanded that I retract my statements or face legal consequences. I laughed. They were scared. But what they didn't know was that the news station had already set a date to air the report. It was too late for them to stop it. On the night the story aired, the entire neighborhood watched. The news segment exposed everything: the unfair fines, the forced foreclosures, the secret deals with developers. They even tracked down homeowners who had been pushed out and forced to sell. By morning, the HOA's reputation was in shambles. But the best part: the news station ambushed Carter for an on-camera interview. They confronted him in front of the HOA office, showing him the documents and asking for a response. He panicked. He tried to deny everything, but the evidence was undeniable. He started blaming others, claiming he didn't know about the property deals. It was pathetic. And the neighborhood? They had seen enough. By the end of the day, an emergency HOA meeting was called. The community was ready to fight back, and Carter had no idea what was coming next. The battle wasn't over. But for the first time, the HOA was on the defensive. And soon, justice would be served. The HOA had spent years bullying, fining, and destroying lives, believing they were untouchable. But now, their empire was crumbling. The news report had ignited a firestorm of outrage. Neighbors who had once been silent out of fear were now furious and ready to fight. And at the center of it all? Me. But I wasn't done yet. It was time to finish this. The morning after the news report aired, the HOA called for an emergency meeting. They sent out official letters, desperately trying to convince the community that it was all a misunderstanding. I knew better. This wasn't about clarifying anything. It was about damage control. But what they didn't expect. I had a plan. With the help of Lisa and a few other neighbors, we gathered every single piece of evidence: documents, emails, witness statements, and even video clips of Carter himself lying on camera. If they wanted a meeting, we'd give them one they'd never forget. That evening, the community center was packed. Homeowners who had never attended an HOA meeting before now filled every seat, their faces filled with anger and determination. At the front of the room, Carter and the HOA board sat stiffly, trying to keep their composure. But I could see it in their eyes, they were nervous. Carter cleared his throat, gripping his microphone. "We understand that there have been concerns raised," he began, forcing a smile. "But I assure you, the HOA has always acted in the best interest of this community." The crowd erupted in boos and shouts of disbelief. I didn't wait. I stood up, holding a folder full of evidence in my hands. "Then explain this," I said loudly, walking toward the front. "Explain how you've been illegally fining homeowners while selling off foreclosed properties for a profit." I tossed a stack of documents onto the table in front of him. The papers slid across the surface, landing right in front of the board members. Lisa stood beside me, arms crossed. "Or how about this? Emails from you, Carter, discussing ways to encourage certain homeowners to leave." Murmurs spread through the crowd. The tension in the room was thick. Carter's face turned red. This is out of context," he stammered. "We were only enforcing community guidelines." I took a deep breath, then looked him in the eye. "Then why did you destroy my yard without notice?" I asked. "Why did you steal my property, lie to my face, and try to cover it up?" Silence. He had no answer. But before he could speak, someone from the back shouted, "You did the same thing to me!" Then another voice. And another. One by one, homeowners stood up, sharing their own horror stories. Fines for Christmas decorations. Fines for leaving a trash can out 5 minutes too long. Foreclosures over ridiculous technicalities. It was a wave of fury. The board members looked panicked. They whispered to each other, realizing they had lost control of the room. Then came the final blow. A woman in a crisp suit stood up near the back. I recognized her immediately. She was the lawyer I had spoken to a few days earlier. She adjusted her glasses and addressed the crowd. "My name is Rebecca Lawson, and I'm an attorney representing several homeowners in this room," she announced. "After reviewing the HOA's financial records, I have reason to believe that multiple crimes have been committed, including fraud and illegal property seizures." Gasps filled the room. Carter's face turned ghostly pale. "I'll be filing a lawsuit," Rebecca continued. "And I encourage anyone here who has been wrongfully fined, harassed, or had their property stolen to join us." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Carter tried to stand up and argue, but it was over. The community had turned against him. The HOA was finished. By the next morning, word had spread like wildfire. Social media was flooded with clips from the HOA meeting. The local news covered it extensively, labeling it the HOA scandal that shook the neighborhood. But the biggest news? Carter resigned. The pressure was too much. He walked away, hoping to avoid further scrutiny. But it didn't matter. His name was already ruined. The other board members followed, one by one, leaving the HOA in shambles. And as for me? I finally got justice. Not only was I refunded for every bogus fine, but my yard was completely restored, paid for by the HOA's remaining funds before the new leadership took over. But most importantly, the HOA's power was gone. No more unfair fines. No more abuse. No more corruption. Our neighborhood was finally free. And it all started with one stolen yard. With the HOA's corruption exposed and their leadership in shambles, the battle was nearly over. But I knew one thing for certain: they weren't getting away without consequences. They had destroyed my property. They had harassed my neighbors. They had terrorized an entire community. Now, it was time to make sure they paid for every single thing they had done. The day after Carter resigned, I met with Rebecca Lawson, the attorney leading the lawsuit against the HOA. We sat in her office, surrounded by stacks of legal documents, witness statements, and financial records. "Now that Carter's out, the HOA is in free fall," Rebecca said, flipping through some papers. "But we're not stopping here. We have enough to file a class action lawsuit against them for fraud, illegal property seizures, and harassment." I nodded, gripping my coffee cup. "I want to make sure they can never do this again." She smiled. "Oh, don't worry. We're about to make sure this HOA is either completely reformed or shut down for good." That was exactly what I wanted to hear. As news of the lawsuit spread, more and more homeowners stepped forward. Dozens of people joined the case, sharing their horror stories. A retired veteran who had been fined into foreclosure. A single mother who had been harassed for years over trivial violations. An elderly couple who had lost their home over a missing mailbox number. Each story added fuel to the fire. The HOA wasn't just corrupt, they were predators. But this time, they had picked the wrong people to mess with. With the lawsuit officially filed, the new HOA leadership tried to control the damage. They sent out desperate letters, promising reform and fair treatment. But it was too late. The damage was already done. The community had seen the truth, and there was no going back. Even worse for them? The state had taken notice. Local government officials had begun investigating the HOA's financials, and what they found was even worse than we expected. The HOA had been engaging in outright fraud. Fake violations to collect fines. Illegal foreclosures on homes. Pocketing community funds for personal use. And when the authorities found evidence of tax fraud? That was the final nail in the coffin. A month after we filed the lawsuit, the HOA's entire leadership was officially dismantled. Carter? Indicted for fraud and embezzlement. Several board members? Facing lawsuits and criminal investigations. And the HOA itself? Completely restructured. Gone were the corrupt enforcers and their ridiculous fines. In their place was a new leadership team, one elected by the community, for the community. But for me, the best part came when I got my final letter from the HOA's lawyers. A formal apology. A complete refund for every fine I had ever been charged. And a promise that they would be covering the full cost of restoring my yard. Justice. With the nightmare finally over, the neighborhood felt different. No more fear of sudden fines. No more ridiculous rules. No more threats from a corrupt HOA. For the first time in years, we had our freedom back. And as I stood in my yard, watching as workers replanted the trees, replaced the bushes, and restored everything that had been stolen from me, I realized something. They had tried to take everything from me. They had tried to break me. But in the end, they lost. And I had won. This battle wasn't just about a yard. It was about standing up to corruption. It was about proving that no one is above the law. And most of all, it was about fighting back and winning.